is have, for instance, this representation of the world. It's 16th century, and you see that you have very few, basically, empires that are organizing the world. That's another representation that's another representation where you have few rulers that are basically organizing the world. This period, we know it and we understand it as the early period of colonization. Now, colonization is really interesting for people who study borders because it's through colonization, there is a generalization of the two instruments I talked about. We use law and treaty to organize ownership, and we use maps to actually represent it. Right? And so we have a discussion here around these ideas. And I come back to this just because I need to summarize this fairly quickly. The idea of writing borders in treaties comes from Hugo Grotius, who was a Dutch lawyer at the time, and he innovated in a way by saying, you've been at war, but in peacetime you are peers, so you can draft contract like a business corporation and agree on what is owned by whom, or what kingdom owns what. And this is written in the Peace of Westphalia. And then we have John Harrison, who was a wood carver, who invents the chronometer. He's the first one who actually is able to organize wood pieces into a clock that is not subjected to cold and warm temperature, and therefore is so steady that you can use it with a sextant to both measure longitude and latitude. So until that chronometer, for those of you who are interested in sailing, you can see evidence that boats were very often lost in the Pacific, even in the Atlantic, trying to look for a harbor on an island that they could never locate weeks after weeks after weeks. And thanks to him, it's the end of this period, because suddenly maps become extremely precise. And then the process of colonization really generalizes this. As empires expand, we use these technologies, we have more and more treaties among the different kingdoms, and more maps are drafted. And this comes up at the end of the First World War, as I would say the first complete generalization of this process with the Paris Convention in 1919. That process is very well described by Margaret Macmillan. It's one of my favorite books, that's why I put it here. In Paris 1919, she discusses how treaties and maps are used by the different embassies from around the world as they are presenting their cases, and as the world is basically being reorganized into a massive sets of treaties. We can't say just one, it's a number of treaties that reorganize the world. And there are three fundamental empires there, the American, the British, and the French Empire, that have alliances across the world, but basically decide who owns what. One of the things that is really well documented in this book is how communities and nations, ethnic groups, or groups that are bound together by language or culture, actually have no influence and are not heard. What matters to the empires is the rail lines, the harbors, the mines, the oil fields, and so on and so forth. So you have to note here that the idea of sovereignty which is implicit here, is also an idea where you have a very few, very powerful empires that are organizing the world top down. I summarize this here because it is very recent in a way. I know for you it's probably your grandparents or your great-grandparents even, but it's only 100 years old. that we have this complete generalization of both legal and cartographic instruments to organize the world on a world scale, not just Europe with Westphalia, right? We're talking about 1919, the generalization of this process, the implementation of boundary lines, both in law and in cartography around the whole world. And this is thanks to those two technologies, the idea that international treaties are international agreements and that we can map them out. It's fairly recent, 100 years old. So it is also very important to realize that early scholarship on borders and boundaries did not view borderlands from the perspective of people and communities, but focused on powers. And Woodrow Wilson, the US president, former president of Yale, a legal political science sociology scholar who was enlightened, came up with a 14-point presentation where he actually suggested that sovereignty should be organized from the democratic principles and not from a top-down process. People laughed at him. He was doubtful that he would be appreciated when he arrived in Paris because none of the diplomatic corps in the European empires had taken those ideas seriously. He was ahead of his time by one war. I think it's very important to realize this. If you're interested in border studies, 1919 is the most important year for the modern era. When you look at border disputes today, in Africa, for instance, you refer back to 1919, in Asia as well. In South America, it's a little bit more complex. So in post-1919, this is the world the way we have it, with three major empires and their allies organizing the whole world around them. And then we have the Second World War, which is very important to us because in the post-Second World War, the world, the community, the international community, in other words, the different states and empires, decide that they should organize themselves to prevent such carnage again. And so they organize the world around a number of institutions, institutions that we call international organizations, to basically organize the promotion of cooperation amongst empires, states, nations. The word of the United Nations is about nations, and a nation is separate from a state in the sense that a nation is a reference to a common language, a common ethnic group, a common religion, or a mismatch of these things with a common territory. But the way it's set up here in this case is that for the first time, actually the idea that to promote cooperation, the world should decolonize, and should decolonize according to a different understanding of sovereignty, which is based on the recognition of nations, is very important. So when you look at the work of the United Nations from 1947 until the 1970s, 80s, what you have is a period during which countries are decolonized, but based on principles of sovereignty that are fundamentally different from the ones that inspired the Treaty of Paris in 1919. What is interesting here is that as a result of this process, a number of new countries appear. So it's a very interesting period for us because scholars of borders basically realize that the number of states is expanding, the number of borders are expanding, and what I call the demography of borders is expanding rapidly. Originally, we have a few states that create the United Nations. Probably about a little bit less than 60. And then when you look very carefully at the work of the United Nations, you have maybe 80 additional states that are decolonized on the principle of sovereignty and democracy. But actually what we see is that almost every single year ever since the creation of the United Nations, we have new states that appear. And the total number that we have today is almost 198. According to some discussions, we should actually go beyond 200 states. And so when we look at borders, what we're trying to understand here is what are the mechanisms that justify the creation of those states that are not the ones that have been decolonized and not the ones who were the first in the international community. Because these two groups total about 120. Yet we have maybe another 70 states that have emerged ever since. So what we see actually is that we have a fundamental transformation of the world, where the two technologies I was talking about and the idea that sovereignty is understood differently has led to a transformation of what we call the international community, where we have more and more states appearing on the international scene and wanting to be recognized. And so you have the numbers here with a massive production of borders, especially in Africa, but the numbers are quite impressive. And since 1994, with the United States Convention of the Law of the Seas, you also have now legal instruments to actually mark and delineate precisely maritime borders. Thus, the great importance of islands, because every little rock then in the sea becomes, in a way, a marking point. And so we have today, when you look at border disputes, you have, in a way, a massive amount of border disputes around the world, which result from this progressive, in a way, grinding expansion of the two tools that we have that have become more and more precise. The ability to organize international treaties worldwide, like the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, that basically brings in its wing altogether not the entirety of the UN membership, but I think it's 140 states that have signed it. The United States hasn't. And that basically agree that one agreement is binding and that they will work with it. And the ability with GPS to make maps that are extremely precise to a tenth of the millimeter. So in case you own the same oil field, you can actually calculate how much is yours and how much is your neighbor. Because the line is so thin and can go down the ground as deep as it's needed. So this excess of precision, in a way, can be dramatized or can be seen as a real issue, because suddenly border disputes are organized around this idea that we need to solve all of this. So what do we learn? What we learn from this is that worldwide territory is being organized with two processes, one top-down, one bottom-up. And that likely we have a further fragmentation of the world in the future. In other words, what I'm saying is that, for those of you who followed what happened in Europe recently with Catalonia or with Scotland, which are illustration of this fragmenting process in very peaceful countries, unlike what we have witnessed 2 years ago in Sudan, with Sudan and North Sudan and South Sudan that are still actually at war, even though, for oil issues, they can't really agree with each other. But you have a multiplication of this process. And so we can see basically that this is, progressive implementation of a rational, of a concept of territorial understanding of borders, where law and cartography and understanding of sovereignties are motivating communities to take hold and control the land on which they live. And that's what we know about borders. That's the direction that we have. Sorry about this. That's the direction that we have. And that's kind of where we are at today. At the same time, and for the last 10 years, especially after 9/11, we've become aware of things that were changing. Security is seeping everywhere. We are concerned about security, especially in the West, but it's not just the West. If you go to, Asia, if you go to African countries, if you go to the Middle East, you see that states are also very much concerned about security. And so one way to think about this is to look back at what was the period I just described, what was the process that was in place, and what we are confronted with. So when we look at the 17th, 18th, 19th century, what we have here is basically what Foucault has called the disciplinary era. And what I think is really interesting for us is to realize that legal agreements and cartography was in a way there to prevent movements. And the penultimate example of this is the invention of the identity card in continental Europe during the early part of the 19th century. The idea that if you are born in a specific village, then we can have a card made of you, and that every time you move away from that place, you need to show it up. One way for you to understand this is when you check in a hotel in Europe. It's less the case in North America, but if you check in a hotel in Europe, and I was in Europe last week, I checked in a hotel in a small town of France called Reims, and I'm asked if I need to present a credit card, and the lady says to me, no, I just need your ID. And she wrote down my personal address in Canada. That is the remainder of that idea that every time you move, you write down where you come from and where you're from. In Canada, in the US, we use Visa cards, MasterCards, American Express cards to do this in a way, because it's almost like an ID. But remember the whole debate in the United States about the passport, right? Which is in a way the last step of the implementation of those tools. The ability to know that you are a resident, you are a full citizen of a specific territory, right? So this is, in a way, what we know about borders. The bordering process is, in a way, trying to control flows of individuals. And so we have had techniques that have allowed us to do this. We have used legal systems to implement this, and we have used maps to